The hum of passengers boarding filled the cabin as the final group made their way down the aisle, searching for their seats. It was just another routine flight for flight attendant Lisa Carter, until he walked in. Dressed in a tailored navy suit, with a wristwatch that probably cost more than her entire year's salary, the man moved with quiet confidence. His presence commanded attention, yet he remained polite, nodding to the crew as he made his way to his first-class seat. Lisa's eyes narrowed. Something about him didn't sit right with her. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, too relaxed, too comfortable, as if he actually belonged in a space reserved for the elite. Or maybe it was something else, something unspoken, buried beneath the surface. She had worked in the airline industry long enough to recognize when someone didn't fit the mold. "Excuse me, sir," she said, stepping toward him before he could settle in. "May I see your boarding pass?" The man, who had just placed his leather carry-on in the overhead compartment, turned to her with a polite smile. "Of course," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket and handing it over. Lisa barely glanced at it before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. This section is reserved for first-class passengers." His smile faded slightly, but his voice remained calm. "That's correct. That's my seat." Lisa hesitated, her fingers gripping the boarding pass a little too tightly. She'd seen it before, people who thought they could sneak into first class, hoping no one would call them out. She had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let someone take advantage of the system. "I'm going to need you to step aside while I verify this," she said, her tone firm. A few passengers glanced over, sensing the tension. The man exhaled slowly, but there was no anger in his eyes. Just a quiet patience, like he'd seen this play out before. "Take your time," he said, folding his arms. Lisa marched toward the front of the plane, boarding pass in hand, her heels clicking against the floor. She didn't need to check, she had already made up her mind. A few moments later, she returned with a forced smile, flanked by two uniformed airline staff. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the aircraft," she announced loud enough for others to hear. "Your ticket doesn't check out." A murmur spread through the cabin. Some passengers looked away uncomfortably, while others watched with open curiosity. The man stayed still for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then, without a word, he picked up his bag, adjusted his suit, and turned toward the exit. He didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply walked. Lisa felt a quiet satisfaction. Another job well done. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that in less than 20 minutes, her world was about to change. Because the man she had just kicked off the plane? He wasn't just some passenger trying to sneak into first class. He was the owner of the airline. And he had just decided that today was the day everything would be different. The man stepped off the plane without a word, his polished shoes meeting the airport floor with slow, deliberate steps. Around him, travelers bustled about, lost in their own worlds, checking phones, dragging suitcases, hurrying to their gates. He, however, moved with a different energy. Calm, composed, and in control, even in the face of what had just happened. A security officer gave him a brief glance as he walked past, as if expecting him to protest or cause a scene. But there was no anger in his face, no argument to be made. He simply adjusted the cuffs of his suit jacket and continued toward the nearest lounge. As he entered, the receptionist straightened up instantly, recognizing him. "Mr. Carter," she greeted with a polite nod. "We weren't expecting you here today. Is everything all right?" For a moment, he said nothing. He was still processing what had happened, not because it was new to him, but because it was exhausting. The same routine, the same assumptions, the same disrespect, over and over. He had built his empire from nothing. Growing up in a small, overcrowded apartment, he had learned early on that the world wasn't always fair. He had spent years proving himself, outworking everyone in the room, turning every rejection into motivation. And now, he was a billionaire. Not just any billionaire. He owned businesses across multiple industries, from real estate to technology. And more importantly, he was the majority shareholder of this airline. He had never flaunted his wealth, never needed to. True power didn't come from showing off, it came from knowing you didn't have to. But sometimes, moments like these reminded him that no matter how much success he had, people would still see only what they wanted to see. He exhaled slowly, bringing himself back to the present. "I'm fine," he finally said, his voice measured. "But I need you to get me in touch with the CEO. Now." The receptionist blinked, caught off guard by the seriousness in his tone. She quickly reached for her phone, dialing a number with urgency. As he waited, he glanced back toward the terminal, his mind replaying the last 10 minutes. The flight attendant's face flashed in his memory, her certainty, her authority, her assumption that he didn't belong. He wasn't angry. He was used to moments like these. But that didn't mean he had to let it slide. A voice crackled over the intercom at the front desk, pulling him back to reality. "Mr. Carter, the CEO is on line 1. He picked up the receiver, leaning against the desk. "It's me," he said simply. A moment of silence, then the voice on the other end shifted, laced with sudden concern. "Mr. Carter, I didn't expect a call from you today. What can I do for you?" He paused, considering his next words carefully. "I just got kicked off one of our flights." The silence stretched longer this time. "What?" The voice faltered, the weight of the situation sinking in. That's a mistake. There must be some kind of mix-up. Let me—" "No," he interrupted, his voice calm but firm. "No mix-up. I want you to find out exactly who was involved. I want their names. And I want every detail of how they handle first-class passengers." "Of course, sir. I'll look into it right away." He set the receiver down gently, his decision already made. Back on the plane, Lisa moved through the cabin, checking on passengers and making sure everything was in order. She barely thought about the man she had removed. Just another case of someone trying to take advantage of the system. If anything, she felt a sense of pride. She had upheld the airline's policies, kept order. That was her job, after all. As she reached the front, the captain called her into the cockpit. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "You sure about that guy?" the captain asked, his brow furrowed. "I saw the way he handled himself. Didn't put up a fight, didn't argue. That's not how people react when they're caught trying to sneak into first class." Lisa folded her arms. People like that don't always make a scene. Some of them just think they're above the rules. The captain hesitated as if something didn't sit right with him, but he let out a breath and nodded. "All right. Just wanted to check." Lisa left the cockpit, brushing off the conversation. She had done the right thing. She was sure of it. Meanwhile, in the executive offices of the airline, phone lines buzzed with activity. The CEO's assistant rushed into his office, placing a folder on his desk with wide eyes. "You need to see this," she said, barely able to hide her nerves. The CEO opened the folder and skimmed through the contents. His hands tensed as he flipped the pages. Lisa Carter, flight attendant, employed for 8 years, good record, strict enforcer of policies. But that wasn't what made his stomach drop. It was the passenger's file that followed. Elijah Carter, billionaire investor, majority owner of the airline. The CEO felt his breath hitch. He shot up from his chair, already dialing a number on his phone. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a disaster. Lisa moved through the aisles, offering polite smiles to passengers and checking seatbelts as the plane prepared for takeoff. Everything was running smoothly, just as it should. She had handled the situation earlier with professionalism, ensuring that only paying first-class passengers remained in their designated seats. To her, it was a routine part of the job. But the captain's words lingered in her mind. There had been something about the way the man carried himself. Too composed, too certain. Most people caught in a lie showed at least a flicker of embarrassment, or frustration, or even defensiveness. But not him. He had simply left, quiet and unbothered. Lisa pushed the thought aside. She had followed protocol, and that was all that mattered. Meanwhile, back at the airline's corporate headquarters, the CEO sat frozen in his chair, gripping the phone as if he could somehow will the situation to disappear. His assistant hovered nearby, waiting for instructions, but he had none. What could he possibly say? The owner of the airline had been removed from his own plane by one of their own flight attendants. And not just removed, humiliated, in front of dozens of passengers. The CEO had only met Elijah Carter once, at a shareholders' meeting. He remembered the man's quiet but firm presence, his sharp mind, and the way he never needed to raise his voice to command attention. And now, they had embarrassed him. He dialed a number quickly, his pulse picking up speed. "Elijah," he started the moment the call connected. "I just heard what happened. I want to personally apologize for—" "I don't need an apology," Elijah interrupted, his voice calm. "I need answers." The CEO swallowed hard. "Absolutely. I'm having my team look into it right now. This was a mistake, a huge misunderstanding, and I take full responsibility." There was silence on the other end, the kind that stretched too long, making the CEO shift nervously in his chair. "Do you?" Elijah finally asked. His tone wasn't angry. It was something worse. Disappointed. The CEO ran a hand through his graying hair. I do. And I want to make this right. Let me handle it." Elijah exhaled slowly. "No," he said. "I'll handle it." Then the call ended. The CEO let out a breath, staring at the phone like it had betrayed him. His assistant watched him expectantly. "What do we do?" she asked. The CEO didn't have an answer. He had a feeling that, whatever Elijah Carter had planned, they were all about to find out soon. Back on the plane, Lisa finished her rounds and returned to the galley, grabbing a cup of coffee before settling in for what she expected to be an uneventful flight. She had just taken a sip when another flight attendant, Michelle, leaned in closer. "You know that guy you kicked off?" Michelle whispered. Lisa sighed. "Yes." "Why?" Michelle hesitated. "I overheard something from the gate crew before we left. Apparently, he wasn't just some random passenger. He's a big deal. Like, really big." Lisa frowned. "What do you mean?" Michelle lowered her voice even more. "They said he's Elijah Carter." Lisa's grip tightened on her coffee cup. The name sounded familiar, but it took a few seconds before it fully clicked. She had seen it before, on headlines, in business articles. Elijah Carter, billionaire investor, one of the most influential figures in the industry, and, most importantly, the majority owner of this very airline. Her chest tightened. No, that couldn't be right. The man she had confronted earlier, the man she had publicly removed from the flight, that was Elijah Carter? Lisa felt a sudden wave of heat rush through her. If it was true, then she had just done something that could cost her everything. The rest of the flight felt longer than usual. Every announcement, every interaction with passengers, felt distant as her mind kept circling back to that single thought. Had she really just kicked the owner of the airline off his own plane? When they landed, Lisa was among the first off, moving quickly through the airport terminal. As she reached the crew lounge, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Pulling it out, she saw an email notification from the airline's headquarters. Her stomach dropped. Mandatory meeting. Effective immediately. She didn't need to read the rest to know what it was about. Elsewhere, Elijah Carter sat in his private office, reviewing the flight logs, the policies, and every passenger interaction record from that day. He wasn't reacting emotionally. This wasn't about revenge or pettiness. This was about something bigger. Because if it had happened to him, it had happened to others. He had built his empire on principles of fairness and integrity, but today had exposed a crack in the foundation of the very airline he owned. And he wasn't going to let that go unchecked. The first step? Making sure everyone in the company understood exactly who he was. And what happened next would change everything. Lisa sat in the airline's conference room, her fingers gripping the armrests of her chair. Around her, other crew members shuffled in, murmuring to each other, throwing nervous glances toward the front of the room. No one knew exactly what this meeting was about, but the tension in the air was impossible to ignore. She had barely slept after landing. The moment she stepped off the plane, the whispers had followed. The moment she checked her phone, the reality had sunk in. She had removed Elijah Carter, the man who practically owned the airline, from his own flight. And now, she was sitting in a meeting that could determine her entire future. The door at the far end of the room opened. Conversations died instantly as the CEO entered, followed by a small group of executives. Their faces were tight, unreadable. Lisa swallowed hard. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," the CEO began, his voice steady but clipped. "We have a very important matter to address today." Lisa shifted in her seat, trying to keep her expression neutral. "Before we begin, I want to be clear, this isn't a routine meeting. We are here because a serious incident occurred. One that has forced us to take a hard look at how we operate." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room. Lisa's stomach tightened. A first-class passenger was removed from Flight 247 earlier today. This passenger was Elijah Carter. The silence that followed was deafening. A few people exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others looked down, suddenly very interested in their notepads. Lisa felt her pulse hammer against her ribs. The CEO continued, his voice firm. "I don't need to tell you how much this complicates things. Mr. Carter is not just another passenger. He is our owner, our primary investor. And what happened today was unacceptable." Lisa could feel the weight of the words pressing down on her. "He has requested a full review of our operations. Effective immediately, all first-class procedures, customer interactions, and decision-making processes will be audited." Lisa clenched her hands together in her lap. An audit? That wasn't just about her. That was about the entire system. "Furthermore," the CEO added, his gaze lingering on the crew section of the room, "Mr. Carter has personally asked to meet with those involved." Lisa felt the air rush from her lungs. "A meeting? With him?" The CEO's voice softened slightly, but his expression remained firm. "This is not about punishment. This is about accountability. And we owe Mr. Carter that much." Lisa barely heard the rest of the meeting. Her thoughts were spinning too fast. She wasn't just in trouble. She was about to sit face to face with the very man she had humiliated in front of an entire plane of passengers. As the meeting adjourned, Lisa remained frozen in her chair while the others filed out. She forced herself to take a breath, but it did little to settle the unease twisting in her stomach. Outside the conference room, a private elevator led up to the executive floor. That was where she would be heading next. As she made her way through the hallway, her legs felt heavier with each step. She had handled difficult passengers before. She had stood her ground in heated moments. But this was different. When she finally reached the reception area, the assistant gave her a tight-lipped nod. "He's expecting you." Lisa swallowed and stepped inside. Elijah Carter sat at the far end of the spacious office, his back to the window overlooking the city skyline. His posture was relaxed, but his presence was anything but. The moment she entered, he looked up, meeting her gaze with an unreadable expression. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he leaned forward, folding his hands together. "Sit," he said. Lisa did, trying to keep her hands from trembling. "You know why you're here," he said, his voice calm but firm. She nodded. "Yes, sir." He studied her for a moment before speaking again. Tell me, Lisa, when you removed me from that flight, what were you thinking? Lisa hesitated, forcing herself to choose her words carefully. I was following protocol, sir. I thought there was a mistake with your ticket. His expression didn't change. Did you check? She hesitated, her throat dry. Not as thoroughly as I should have. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly. Do you know how many times I've been in that situation? How many times I've been questioned about whether I belong in a space I already paid for? Lisa felt her chest tighten. I don't need an apology, he continued, his tone measured. What I need is an answer. What made you so sure I wasn't supposed to be in that seat? Lisa opened her mouth, but no words came out. Elijah leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. You see, Lisa, I'm not just here to have a conversation. I'm here because what happened today isn't just about me. It's about the way things work in this company. And I'm going to change that. Lisa's stomach dropped. Before she could say anything, Elijah reached for a folder on his desk. He flipped it open, glancing at a page before looking back at her. This isn't just about one flight, he said. This is about how this airline treats people. And I intend to find out exactly where the problem starts. Lisa felt the weight of his words settle over her like a storm cloud. Something told her this was only the beginning. Lisa sat stiffly in the chair across from Elijah, her pulse thudding in her ears. She could feel the weight of his words, the unshakable certainty in his voice. This wasn't just about her. It was about something bigger, something that went beyond a single flight or one mistake. Elijah flipped through the pages of the folder in front of him, his expression unreadable. Then he stopped, tapping a specific page with his finger before looking up. You weren't the first, he said, his tone calm but firm. Lisa frowned slightly. What do you mean? Elijah leaned back in his chair, studying her for a moment before he spoke again. This isn't an isolated incident. I had my team pull reports from the last 5 years. He slid a sheet across the desk toward her. Do you know how many passengers have filed complaints about being removed from first class under similar circumstances? Lisa hesitated, then glanced down at the paper. Her stomach clenched. There were names, dozens of them. Each one had a complaint attached. Some had been mistakenly removed. Others had been questioned about whether they truly belonged in first class, despite having valid tickets. The patterns were undeniable. Her breath caught as she scanned the list. Some were high-profile names, business executives, investors, even a few celebrities. But others were just everyday people. This airline has a problem, Lisa, Elijah said, his voice measured. And today, you put a spotlight on it. Lisa felt a sinking feeling in her chest. She had always prided herself on following the rules, on enforcing policies fairly. But now, looking at this list, she wondered, had she unknowingly been part of something bigger? She met Elijah's gaze, searching for any sign of anger, but she didn't find any. Instead, there was something far worse, disappointment. I don't blame you for what happened, Elijah continued. But I do expect you to understand the weight of it. Lisa swallowed hard, nodding slightly. I do. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Elijah exhaled and closed the folder. There's more, he said. Lisa's fingers tensed against her lap. More. Elijah's expression darkened just slightly. After I left the plane, I made a few calls. Do you know what I found out? Lisa shook her head slowly. He picked up his phone and swiped to a document before sliding it across the desk toward her. Your airline has been under quiet internal review for months now. Lisa blinked. Review? For what? Elijah leaned forward slightly. Misconduct. Unfair treatment of passengers. Corrupt decision-making at the highest levels. He let his words settle before continuing. I didn't know about it before today. But once I started digging, the pieces started coming together. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about one mistake. There was something happening behind the scenes, something far more dangerous than she had imagined. I was planning to make some changes, Elijah said. But after today, I've decided to take it a step further. Lisa felt a chill move through her. What do you mean? Elijah studied her for a long moment, then finally spoke the words that sent a fresh wave of shock through her. I'm buying the airline. Fully. Lisa's mouth parted slightly, but no words came out. Elijah continued, his voice unwavering. I already own a majority stake. But I've decided that's not enough. By the end of the week, I'll have full control. Lisa gripped the arms of her chair. You're taking over? Elijah nodded. And when I do, things are going to change. Starting from the top. Lisa's mind raced. She had thought this meeting was about her, about what had happened on the flight. But this was something else entirely. Elijah wasn't just looking for an apology. He was here to rebuild everything from the ground up. And Lisa had no idea what that meant for her future. Lisa sat frozen in her chair, Elijah's words still ringing in her ears. He wasn't just taking action, he was taking over. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, but before she could respond, Elijah's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, then stood abruptly, his jaw tightening. I need to take this, he said, stepping toward the window as he answered the call. Lisa stared at him, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what was more shocking, the fact that Elijah was about to own the airline completely, or the fact that she had unknowingly been part of something much bigger than just one bad decision. Elijah's voice was low, firm. Are you sure? He listened for a few moments, his expression darkening. Send it to me now. Lisa shifted in her seat, anxiety creeping in. She didn't dare interrupt, but she could tell something had just changed. A few seconds later, Elijah's phone chimed again. He swiped at the screen, his brows knitting together as he read whatever had just been sent to him. Then, slowly, he turned back to Lisa. You need to see this. Lisa hesitated before taking the phone from his outstretched hand. Her eyes scanned the email, and within seconds, she felt her stomach drop. It was a confidential internal report, one that detailed complaints against upper management. Names, dates, incidents. And at the very top of the list was a name she never expected. Mark Reynolds. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. He was the regional director, the very person she reported to. The man who had always talked about protocol, about keeping things by the book. She had worked under him for years, trusting his leadership. But the report told a different story. It detailed how he had covered up multiple incidents, how he had pressured staff to ignore complaints, and worst of all, how he had specifically instructed flight attendants to be extra cautious with certain passengers. Passengers like Elijah Carter. Lisa's hands shook slightly as she handed the phone back. This can't be real, she whispered. Elijah's jaw tightened. It's very real. Lisa swallowed hard. So, what happens now? Elijah's expression was unreadable. Now? He exhaled slowly. Now, I make sure everyone responsible is held accountable. Lisa felt a lump form in her throat. Including me? Elijah studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. You followed the rules as they were given to you. The problem is, those rules were built on the wrong foundation. Lisa wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or even more uneasy. A knock at the door made them both turn. The assistant peeked inside, her face tense. Mr. Carter, Mr. Reynolds is here to see you. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. Perfect timing. Send him in. Lisa's breath caught as Mark Reynolds stepped into the room, his usual confident stride slightly stiff. His gaze flickered to her before settling on Elijah. "Mr. Carter," he said with a polite nod. "I wasn't expecting to hear from you so soon." Elijah leaned back against his desk, arms crossed. "You weren't expecting to hear from me at all, were you?" Mark hesitated, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "I'm not sure what you mean." Elijah tilted his head slightly. "You've been running this airline for a long time, making decisions, protecting certain interests." His voice remained calm, but there was an undeniable edge to it. "Tell me, Mark, how long did you think you could keep this going?" Mark's posture stiffened just slightly. "I don't know what you're implying." Elijah glanced down at his phone before tossing it onto the desk in front of him. "You covered up complaints. You ignored passenger concerns. You instructed employees to treat certain customers differently. You used your authority to create a culture where bias was disguised as protocol." Mark's face barely changed, but Lisa saw the subtle shift in his expression, the flicker of realization that his secrets were no longer secrets. Elijah let the silence stretch before speaking again. "You were right about one thing, though." He picked up the folder from earlier and tossed it onto the desk. "This airline did need stricter policies, stronger leadership, more accountability." His gaze locked onto Mark's. "Which is why, as of this morning, you've been removed from your position." Mark's breath hitched just slightly, but his face remained neutral. "You can't do that." Elijah smirked. "I can. And I just did." Lisa felt her heart pound as she watched the scene unfold. Mark was always the one in control, the one who dictated the rules. But now, for the first time, he was the one scrambling. Mark's gaze darted toward Lisa, as if searching for some kind of support. But she remained silent. She had followed his orders for years, trusting that they were fair. But now she saw the truth. Elijah straightened. "Security is waiting for you outside. You'll be escorted out of the building." Mark's lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightening. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to argue, but he must have realized there was no use. Without another word, he turned and walked toward the door. The moment it shut behind him, Lisa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Elijah turned to her. "And that," he said, "is how you take back control." Lisa exhaled, shaking her head slightly. "I still can't believe this is happening." Elijah smiled, but there was something thoughtful behind it. "Believe it. And if you want to be part of what happens next, you have a choice to make." Lisa frowned slightly. "What kind of choice?" Elijah gestured toward the seat across from him. "You can walk away. Pretend none of this ever happened. Or," he paused, watching her carefully, "you can help me rebuild this company the right way." Lisa's breath caught. She had spent years working under a system she thought was fair. But now, she saw how much needed to change. She looked at Elijah, the man she had once removed from a plane, now offering her a seat at the table. For the first time in a long time, she knew exactly what she had to do. She took a deep breath, then nodded. "I'm in." Lisa felt a sense of finality settle over her as the weight of the decision sank in. The room that had once felt suffocating now seemed full of possibility. She had spent years believing she was simply following orders, but now she realized she had the power to help change things. Elijah gave her a nod, as if acknowledging her unspoken commitment, then turned toward the window, looking out over the city skyline. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, his voice steady. "It's going to take time. There will be resistance. But I'm not here to maintain the status quo. I'm here to fix what's broken." Lisa let his words settle before speaking. "What happens next?" Elijah turned back to her, a small but knowing smile forming. "We start by rebuilding from the inside out." And that's exactly what they did. Over the next few weeks, the airline underwent a transformation unlike anything it had seen before. Elijah wasted no time implementing new policies that prioritized fairness, transparency, and accountability. He personally reviewed past complaints, making sure every issue that had been ignored was addressed. Employees who had been complicit in discriminatory practices were either retrained or let go. Lisa found herself in a new role, one she never expected. Instead of enforcing outdated policies, she was now part of a team tasked with reshaping them. She worked closely with Elijah, ensuring that no passenger would ever experience what he had gone through that day. The media caught wind of the takeover, and headlines quickly spread. News outlets reported on how Elijah Carter, the billionaire entrepreneur who had once been unfairly removed from a flight, now owned the very airline that had wronged him. But what truly caught the public's attention was not just the power shift, it was the changes that followed. Passengers noticed the difference almost immediately. Customer service improved, complaints were actually addressed, and most importantly, people felt heard. The airline, once plagued by controversy, started earning back trust. Not everyone was happy with the changes, of course. Some members of the old leadership resisted, hoping Elijah would eventually ease up. But he never did. He remained firm in his vision, proving time and time again that he wasn't just making a statement. He was making a real difference. Lisa, who had once feared what this shift would mean for her career, found herself feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: purpose. She no longer walked through the airport feeling like just another employee enforcing rules she didn't believe in. Now she was part of something meaningful. One afternoon, as she reviewed some updated policies in her office, a soft knock sounded at the door. She looked up to see Elijah leaning against the frame. "How's it going?" he asked. Lisa smiled, setting down the paperwork. "Better than I expected." He stepped inside, taking a seat across from her. "You've been doing great work," he said. "You could have walked away from all of this, but you didn't. That says a lot." Lisa hesitated, then exhaled. "I guess I realized that ignoring a problem doesn't make it go away. And I didn't want to be the kind of person who looks the other way anymore." Elijah nodded slowly, as if he already knew that about her. "That's why you're here," he said simply. A comfortable silence stretched between them before Elijah finally stood. "We're just getting started," he added. "But I think we're on the right track." Lisa watched him leave, feeling a quiet sense of certainty settle in her chest. He was right. The work wasn't over, and there would always be more to do. But for the first time in a long time, she knew she was exactly where she needed to be.